What's up, friends? Today we're gonna have a look at 3 simple ideas that are crucial for you to reach the level of 2000 in chess. And if that sounds too optimistic, let me tell you that it's actually based on a true story. I always love receiving messages from the Igor Nation, from you guys, and recently I've got a message from Henry from Spain who shared that it was enough for him just to implement those couple ideas to get his chess to the next level, and he was actually surprised that it turned out to be that simple. I'm going to share these 3 ideas with you, and we're going to train them together so that you are ready to implement them right after watching this video. So here's the first example. It is black to play. I'm using games of the student Henry, which he shared with us, so why not? I think this is going to be more relatable than watching Carlsen's games that are just way too advanced. In the current position, we can see that white is threatening pawn to e5 with a double attack to these minor pieces. So how would you play here if you are black? I'm pretty sure that a lot of players in such case, seeing the threat coming, would take on e4. And if you're part of the Igor Nation for some time, then you know our favorite rule to take is a mistake, right? So as you release the tension, you usually help your opponent to activate his pieces. This is the case for the vast majority of the positions, including this one. If black were to take on e4, which would be wrong for black, that would help white to activate the knight, put it to a more active square, to open up the bishop, and overall this makes white's position better. So you do not want to take it again. To take is a mistake. That's why in the game Henry played pawn to e5, counter-striking in the center. Now white played pawn takes d5, which allows black to improve the position of his knight. So it's interesting that white is now making these mistakes. Pawn takes. Now I played rook to e1, trying to pin this pawn down to the queen. Therefore black plays knight to d7, overprotecting the pawn on e5. Now bishop c4. This time white is trying to pin the knight. Black played queen to g6, and here notice what makes this same mistake once again. White finally decided to capture on e5, which allows black to activate his knight, as well as to attack this bishop, and black's position becomes really good at this point. Now white needs to do something about this bishop. He decided to trade it off, and then he played queen e2. Not exactly sure why. Anyway, black continued bishop to g4, developing a bishop with a tempo. Now the queen needs to go. Black played b6, this time setting it up for the pin with bishop to c5. White played b4, and black plays rook to e8, bringing the last piece into play, and white's position actually falls apart. There's way too many things that black can execute on the next move. White played king h1, but then followed knight to d3, attacking the queen, attacking the rook, and white lost within a couple of moves. I'll show it real quick because white is down material, so by now it's pretty easy for black, and that was a checkmate. By the way, here's a fun fact about this game. In his matches that he shared with me, Henry wrote that for a long time, facing players rated above 2000 felt hopeless for him. He almost felt like he's about to lose before the game even begins. But after implementing those couple ideas that we're talking about in this video, he, surprisingly for him, started beating these guys quite regularly. And in this case, white player is rated 2050, so he's not a beginner player, but you can see how easy it was for black to win. All right, now there's another thing that I want to point out here just as an additional reminder. I remember many years ago when I was just a kid learning chess, my coach told me that, it's okay to lose sometimes, everyone does, but it's not okay to lose when a bunch of your pieces are still undeveloped. And that's a mistake that happens, as we can see, even on the level of 2000 and above, right? So white players is fairly high rated, but is still losing the game with these pieces being completely undeveloped. But we're going to talk about that in a minute. Here's the second game that'll illustrate the second rule, equally important, if not more important. It is white to play. The position is sharp. Black's king is exposed, but on the other hand, black is also putting some pressure to the king side. The knight is ready to jump somewhere, even though still looks like black's situation is shaky. So what is the right approach for white to handle this? How would you play here if you're white? If you turn on Stockfish, it actually says that pawn takes e5 is the best move for white, grabbing material, and Stockfish claims that white is winning there. But in the reality, I would wish to highlight that in an opening, you gotta keep focus on the main 3 opening tasks, which are to develop minor pieces, to castle and connect the rooks. Right? We're going to see exactly how you do that. If you stay focused on this main plan, you don't deviate to other ideas that can drive you off track and can make you lose the game. So while d takes e5, objectively speaking, is the best move, I like that white in reality played pawn to d3, opening up the bishop as well as attacking the queen, because again, in an opening, the primary task is to develop. Now black played knight to f4, covering the diagonal, as well as counter-attacking this queen. So white decided to take it off. And here we have a relatively similar situation. Stockfish once again claims that white's gotta grab a pawn and that it's good for white. But in the game, Henry played knight c3, just finalizing development. And now white has finished the three main opening tasks. He has developed pieces, he has castled, and he has connected the rooks, meaning that the rooks are looking at each other and there are no other pieces in between them. And once the three main opening tasks are finished, you may then start thinking about your attacking plan. But when you just follow these simple three rules, you will ensure that you play opening in a decent manner and you avoid any opening disasters and traps. Here black played pawn to g6. Perhaps he was worried that if this pawn is undefended and queen moves away, maybe we'll be able to capture that and play queen to d7 checkmate. I guess something like that. Now, once you finish the opening tasks, after that it's perfectly fine to start attacking and playing aggressive moves. Therefore here white captured this pawn on a5. And black realized that capturing it back is probably not such a great idea, because after rook e1, rook e8 is actually coming on the next move thanks to this bishop from b5. Therefore, instead of this, black played bishop to g7, perhaps hoping to get it back on the next move. But now after d4, white protected this pawn. And it turns out that once again, black can't capture that hanging pawn because of rook d1, this time winning the queen along this file. So queen takes d4 is not an option. Black played pawn to a6, bishop a4, and now black's position is completely lost. His king is exposed, he's down 2 pawns, and like there's nothing he can do. In the game, he played bishop to d5 and resigned because he realized that knight takes d5 is coming and the last move of black was actually a blunder, but his position was lost anyway. Remarkably, the black player is rated 2150. So once again, you see that it's possible to defeat even fairly strong players just by following these classical chess rules. And let me reinforce this general idea once again, because while talking to students, to different people, I see that sometimes people feel that they aren't even sure if it's doable for them to reach the level of 2000. Like they talk about that like, oh, my goal is to get like 2000 or maybe 1800. Like I'm not sure if it's possible. I've started playing chess later, like not as a kid. And so people are doubting even the possibility of reaching that level. But while you see that, sometimes you're just a few steps away from reaching to that level. Just a couple new ideas. I mean, if you just reduce blunders in your games, that's already plus 300 rating points in no time, right? So sometimes it's much easier than it seems. Alright, we have discussed what to do in an opening. You follow the three main opening tasks. You develop pieces, you castle and connect the rooks. What do you do after that? For the rest of the game, basically. Then there is another way of thinking which is highly useful. Here's the final game we're gonna take a look at today. Henry is playing white against another opponent rated above 2000, and it is white to move. Now, there is a usual way of thinking that people think about like their pieces and then they ask themselves, where should I move them? Right? Or they try to parry threats of their opponents. But there is another way of thinking which is completely different, which I encourage you to take on, especially in the middle game stage. It is when you start looking at the opponent's half of the board and you ask yourself, how do I go forward into that enemy territory and hopefully attack something or capture something? And as you think that way, you realize that the amount of options you have available are usually very few. Like you usually have very few meaningful attacking moves on opponent's half of the board. For example, in this case, how can you really advance to an opponent's half of the board and attack something? I can see only two options, which are either pawn to e5 or knight to c6, and I like both of them. In the game, he played pawn to e5, but again, you see that you narrow it down to just a few moves instead of thinking about all kinds of moves you could possibly play. And these moves are usually the best, so they are easier to find and they are better. Now, white played pawn e5, attacking here the knight, attacking this pawn. Black recaptured, queen takes e5. This time we're putting pressure to the rook and this pawn on e7. Black correctly played rook to b1, trying to counterattack. But now queen takes e7, at least white manages to snatch a pawn. And after a trade on e1, black played pawn to a5. It still looks like black is much better. This pawn is going forward and it's unclear what could white oppose to it. But you can use the same way of thinking. Look at opponent's half of the board and ask yourself, how can you move forward and create some threats? And with that in mind, white played queen to e7, which is a great move. Now from here, the queen starts creating some counter threats, which black has to parry. Black played queen a1. He's actually a strong player, so he's also trying to attack. King h2, queen takes c3. Actually, black blundered that after queen to d8 check, the only move for black to cover is bishop to f8, but that move leaves this knight on f6 undefended. So black played bishop f6, but white actually blundered the same thing as well. He did not notice that the knight is hanging. Actually, again, I'm keeping it real, I'm showing you the games of an adult amateur player, right? He's probably just like you, and he was rated 1600, probably right now he's higher rated. But you see that this is like very real thing for you to follow, and you can achieve the very same results. So white instead played knight c6, once again aiming to move forward, and that actually confused black. Black probably was worried about knight e7 check or something like that. He played queen to c5, which is wrong, and after queen takes f6, black resigned because white eventually took this knight anyway. And now if black tries to push the pawn, white would just go knight e5, attack this pawn, maybe bishop d5 in the future if this queen moves away, and white is winning the game easily. All right, let's sum up. We've talked about three main themes. First is opening tasks. What do you do in an opening? You develop pieces, castle, and connect the rooks. And as long as you stay focused on this most important thing, you play opening on a high level and you avoid any opening disasters. Next, what do you do in the middle game? You look at your opponent's half of the board and you ask yourself how to go forward and create some threats there. Usually there are only a few moves available, and therefore it's easier for you to find them and they're stronger. That's how you play a middle game well. And finally, we also talked about a very common pattern called to take is a mistake. This is like a more smaller rule, more tactical rule, but it occurs in pretty much every game that you play, and that's why it's so useful to be aware of that. And again, implementing just a couple ideas sometimes is enough to advance your chess skills significantly. In his message, Henry actually shared also the photos from the tournament, an international tournament that he won recently, as well as all these games against opponents rated above 2000, where he managed to win, which seemed impossible for him not too long ago. And he said that he only studied several lessons from the course 3 Steps to 2000 ELO, and he hasn't performed practice yet, but still just implementing those few ideas was enough to break through his chess. So again, you're much closer to your chess goals than you probably think. And if you want to study the same course 3 Steps to 2000 ELO, where I go in more depth about this subject, you can click the link below the video in the description and study it, so hopefully you'll be the next success story that I share.